ahead and introduce yourself and tell us when you started playing Eve and why.
Hi guys, yeah, my name is Itaer. I started playing Eve in 2007, which is a crazy thing for me to say. Um, but I've always been a small gang PvPer, and I've lived mainly in low second wormhole space, but I've experienced all aspects of the game. And despite it being 2007 when I started, I do remember how confusing the game was
Hmm.
when I first started. And some of that's been addressed in the meantime, and some of it hasn't. So definitely have some thoughts on that.
Great. So we all have our platform on what we're running on. What is yours? What are the top 3 items?
So the top 3 items for me are number one, and this is by far the biggest one, is communication, right? And like I said, I've been playing the game a long time. This has always been a problem. I was there when the CSM was first brought up as an idea, and the big part of that was the need for more communication. But we're still here today. We're still talking about it, which does make it sound slightly insurmountable. But the flip side of that is that as a CSM member, actual communication is really the only thing that I can promise, right? I can promise that I will talk to you about anything that CCP will let me, right? To the extent allowed by the NDA. People who make promises about like, oh, we're going to get this change made, we're going to add this to the community, we're going to move this around. Well, I mean, you don't have developer power, right? You can lobby CCP for this, and I think that the CSM has power when they act together and when they bring data to CCP, but you can't make any promises, right? Because you're not a game developer. But I can promise, to explain CCP's decision making. That's what I have learned from talking to other CSM members, former CSM members, is that they are given a lot of rationale and explanation, which is not under the NDA. It's just explanation. A lot more than is given to the community generally, right? So you are able to justify decisions that CCP makes, to explain their reasoning without breaking in the NDA. But beyond the scope that we normally see from CCP. So I think that is a super important and a super attainable idea as a CSM member.
Anything else that you particularly want to...
Oh, right. Sorry. Yeah, the other two.
Yeah.
Yeah, so the other two, it sort of follows number one, which is number two is iteration, right? I mean, this is the same thing. It's been a pain point forever, but it is really, really important. I really want to lean on CCP and help them understand the importance of iterating on things after they come out, right? It's very frustrating because often we don't understand exactly what the problems are with the feature until it has been released to the community, right? Until 20,000 people have played with it at the same time. And then after all this work has been done to build a feature, to build an idea, to build an expansion, to not make minor changes on it is so wasteful, right? Because if you have done all the work already, then just tweaking the numbers or tweaking a little interaction on top of that goes a huge way to making that work worthwhile, right? To making that work have meant a lot more than it would have if you just release a feature as it was and let it die. And number 3 is a focus on the little things. And this is partially iteration, but it is distinct. A long time ago, CCP Carker started a thread, and they solicited ideas from the community for little things, quality of life changes, UI changes. But it's turned out that some of the best changes the game has ever seen have come from this thread. And so while this hasn't stopped or anything, I really want to see CCP make a commitment to continuing this and maybe giving CCP Carker a little bit of help, because I think that that thread and CCP Carker's work in particular has an outsized impact on the game, right? I think for the amount of dev time that this consumes, the little things that have been added to the game have been hugely impactful, right? They've made a really big difference. So I want to make sure that we keep doing that. So those are my 3 big things: communication, iteration, and the little things.
So speaking of the little things, is there anything in particular that you would absolutely love to see? Because the CSM is given reign from time to time to give them our list of things. So what maybe 3 things that you would really like them to implement?
I mean, where do I even start? I think everyone who plays this game for any length of time develops a gigantic wish list. But right off the top of my head, I would love to see notes on ships in hangars, right? I people talk about this all the time. You have a ship. Do you name it like a cool name, a name you like, or do you name it to remember, this Tengu has heavy missiles, the other one has hams, and there's heavy missiles but with active shield, heavy missiles with passive shield, whatever, right? And then if you name that, you have to do some sort of code so that people can't just look at your ship and know how you're fit, but you have to remember it. It's silly, right? And this is a relatively small investment in dev time, and it'd be impactful to quite literally everyone who plays the game, right? So it's a great example of, small effort, huge impact. Another thing I'd love to see, and this is probably slightly more technically challenging, but I'd love to see a way to tie ACLs to corp roles, right? So to give someone a
Oh,
role and
yeah.
to simultaneously manage them on the ACL. Yeah.
Anything else before we move on to the next question?
I think those are the two off the top of my head. But I mean, I think everyone, like I said, everyone has a wish list, and something that I mentioned in my forum thread, which you should all go read, of course, is I would love to see the ability. So, CCP Carker is only one person, and they've done incredible work, and I'm sure they have some support generally, right? But it can be hard to decide, what things the community really wants, what things to work on. And something we've seen have huge success in other games is polling the player base to decide what the priority is. Now, I don't think that this has a place in Eve for very, very large scale things like game balance or expansions or things like that, right? When it comes to quality of life, little things, I think that it's a super good idea to ask the community, like, hey, we have a limited amount of dev time. What is the most important thing to you, right? Do you prefer, corp ACLs, or do you prefer notes on ships? I think it'll be notes on ships for sure, right? But this guarantees that the dev time is spent in a way that's the most impactful, and it gives the community agency, which I think is something that is really lacking in the CCP community interaction, is the feeling of community agency, right? A lot of the time, it's you see people just spinning their wheels. Everyone on Reddit is saying the same thing. Everyone on the forums is saying the same thing. All my friends agree. We want this thing. It never happens, right? And whether or not there's a good reason for that is neither here or there. But it's I think important that community feels like they're heard and feels like they have a sense of agency. And I think that the best way I can imagine that happening is to have a polling system for which little things are going to take priority for development time.
Yeah, I really like that idea. So now we're going to go and we're going to start thinking about the new players. What do you think today is the biggest challenge facing the brand new players coming into EVE?
I mean, they certainly have a lot of problems, but I think probably it's a combination of just general information overload, which is not necessarily something that you're going to get away from. I mean, it is Eve at the end of the day, and that means a certain things, right? But I think that there are a lot of problems that are solvable, right? A lot of things that bother new players that are solvable, and I think the biggest one off the top of my head is the year plus train of essentially mandatory skills before you can be any good at things. And this is compounded by the fact that the most accessible type of PvP, which is faction warfare, frigate PvP. If you do not have the skills that make you good, you have nothing and you suck, right? I mean, you can watch some videos, fly your Condor or your Merlin perfectly, and lose because you have T1 guns and level 2 shield skills, right? And I think this is really, really frustrating. All the people that I've taught PvP are very frustrated by this. Now, there are ways to alleviate this, flying in groups, flying certain types of ships, flying different roles within groups. But these are band-aids over a really very real problem, which is that when you start the game, before you have a year of training into these mandatory skills, your character's terrible, right? And there's been various levels of this throughout the game. I mean, when I started, there were learning skills, which were a terrible idea and were thankfully removed, but we still have attributes, which are a very confusing system and very punishing for new players, especially when it compounds with these mandatory skills being all over the place in terms of attribute distribution. So I think that there is needless complexity in the early game that could be removed. Complexity is part of EVE, and that's fine, but some of it is not necessary.
Totally agree on that one. So the next question is, what do you think that CCP could do to help player retention?
Well, I think removing the needless complexity, like I just said, is a really big part of it. But I also think that some of the stuff CCP has done over the last few years has gone a long way to improving new player retention. Reworking the tutorial, an emphasis on discovery and corp discovery and things like that. And I've also seen the community really step up in my time playing the game. When I started, there was very little in the way of support for new players from the community, and that has totally turned the corner, right, in the last 10 years, with the large null sec groups, but also groups that recruit high sec players, many groups that recruit low sec players. Eve Rookies, for example, does a lot of different aspects of it, and so this is something that we're doing. But I think what CCP could do is support these groups, right? They're very afraid, generally speaking, of sort of advertising community groups, and I understand the reason for that. But I think that it is worth the time to do whatever vetting that they think is necessary to go through and advertise these groups, right? Co-host streams on Twitch, have some mechanism in game by which new player-friendly groups that are approved can be discovered by players, right? I think that these kind of investments will pay huge dividends in terms of retention and are absolutely worth the effort.
So then, when is the last time that you actually ran through the NPE?
So the last time I did the NPE was, I want to say about a year ago, maybe more now. Whenever they released that new you start in an Astero
Yeah.
NPE. Yeah, exactly. So I ran through that when it came out to see what it was like. So I don't know exactly when that was. I would say 1 to 2 years ago.
Yeah, it was 2.5, something like that.
2.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, so it's been a minute. It has been a minute.
Okay. Now, as you said before, community has really kind of stepped up within EVE. Now, I've only been playing for about 5 years now, so I kind of walked straight in from day one to the NPSI community. And that really kind of opened my eyes to what community can be in EVE. What's the definition of community in EVE to you?
I mean, community is people who teach each other, I think is the biggest thing for me. And obviously there's many, many aspects of that. But like I've been saying, EVE is a really complicated game. And I've been playing for 17 years. There's things I still don't know, right? About industry, about sovereignty mechanics, things that I don't touch on. And so you can always, always, always learn more about different aspects of the game. That's never more true than when you're a new player. And so, I think that yeah, people who teach each other, even in my corp, which has many veteran players who have been playing for many, many, many years, I would think that, if CCP knew how much of our discussion was just explanations of some mechanic or another to another member of the corp, they'd be shocked, right? We've been playing this game for 10, 20 years, some of us, and we still hop in every day and we say, hey guys, how does this work? And someone will say, oh yeah, no, I know that one. Let me explain it to you, right? And for me, that's one of the biggest forms of community is people who teach each other.
Cool. Now, one of the things I hear from a lot of new players is they feel that there's a lot of toxicity in EVE. Now, of course, when we talk about toxicity, a new player that gets ganked, going through Dama is like, oh my god, it's so toxic. I'm not talking about ganking. I'm not talking about PvP. What I'm talking about is the, racism, the homophobia, the, all the stuff that we just shouldn't even be thinking about in 2024 that gets brought into the game. What's your stance on toxicity, and do you think it's an issue?
It's definitely an issue. However, I think I'd be remiss if I didn't point out that, like you've been saying, the community has come a huge way, right? When I started this game, it was significantly more of a problem than it is now, which is not to say that it is not still a problem, because it absolutely is. But what I mean is that I'm really proud of some of the ways in which the community has stepped up and sort of collectively decided that this isn't a thing that belongs in our game. And there's still a lot of work to do. But I think that, when I see groups, they get their dirty laundry aired, the best cure is sunlight, right? So when I see people who have some community that's been harboring some of this and it gets posted and everyone collectively rejects it, every time that happens, we move closer to being the tolerant community that we should be, right? EVE is for everyone. And for a very long time, it's very hard for many groups of people to get involved in the game because of the attitude of some players. So I think that we need to encourage, when it happens, we need to encourage people to push back on that, right? I think that it makes a big difference. And I think that the more we do it, the easier it gets.
I agree too. And then when you personally encounter it, what do you do?
Well, I'm lucky that I have a close group of friends that I play the game with, and we've all agreed that there is no place for that in the group. And so I honestly can say that I really don't encounter anything like that really all that often, except perhaps in local chat, and then you just report them and move
Right.
on. But like I said, I think that in a general sense, when we encounter that, the best thing that we can do is reject it, actively and publicly, and say, hey, this person, they said this thing, they have this view, and we don't agree with that, and there's no place for that in EVE, and tell that to people, right? But the worst thing is to be passive, right? That accomplishes nothing.
Yeah, I totally agree. You know, I preach this to my own community, and I try to get other communities to follow through that when you see it, say something. Because if everyone gets together and doesn't tolerate it, it makes it very uncomfortable for the people that are doing it.
That's exactly right.
They go away or stop.
Exactly.
Now, on to my favorite part of the interview is we're going to play Let's Pretend. You have just gotten elected to CSM19. So,
you have a crystal ball. Excellent.
Yes. So, you are in your first meeting where they reveal the plans for the next expansion, maybe the next year, maybe even the next 2 years. Not one thing that you campaigned for or have expertise in made it to the expansion. What do you think you're going to do?
Well, this is a bit of a facetious answer, but of course, since my main campaign pillar is communication, this is not a huge problem, right? I'd like to understand why they chose to, focus on certain things and why they didn't, and why they made the choices they make, and then take a lot of notes, right? Write that down, help myself understand what exactly is going on here, so that I can answer the questions that the community has. Hey, why was this change made? Why did this change not make it in? Was it a question of dev time, or was it actually something that we disagreed on? And I think that people lean on the NDA a little too much here. But like I said, talking to former CSM members, I understand now that there is a lot of communication that CCP gives to CSM that is not under NDA, right? So yes, I can't go and say, wow, yes, they were going to implement this mechanic, or they thought about this, they didn't do it. But if the community says like, hey, we really wanted to see a change to this thing and it wasn't put in there, I can either say, well, we're still thinking about it, or I can say, hey, they actually thought about it and they decided that that was not a change they wanted to go forward with for this, and this reason.
Okay. And you know as well as I do, if you play this game long enough, they're going to change the way we play or even completely axe things that we really, really love. For myself, the interceptors, when they were, able to go through bubbles, that got changed, and I'm just like, yeah, I don't want to hunt anymore. To this day, I still haven't figured out how to use the dang module. What do you think you're going to do if something that your community, the people that, put you into the CSM seat, really, really love, sorry, it's late. CCP decides that, they're going to get rid of it or change it. What do you think you're going to do?
Yeah. So before I decided to run for the CSM, my general impression was that CCP never listened to the CSM about anything, right? Which is perhaps a bit pessimistic. And like I said, I've had a lot of really interesting conversations with people who used to be on the CSM or still are. And the impression that I've gotten now is that you can make a difference if you come to CCP as a united front. If the CSM in general agrees on something, that has a huge amount of impact. And they can also you can also make a really big difference if you have data reasoning. If you just go to CCP and you say, hey, we really don't like this change, this is not impactful, right? So the biggest things you can do, if they were going to nerf one of our main sources of content, like deleting skyhooks from the game, for example, the biggest things that I could see myself doing, right, is talking to other CSM members and building a consensus, right? So the skyhooks, for example, I think it'd be very easy to get everyone to agree that a change was warranted, but this change was too far, right? And then you can maybe brainstorm some potential ways that might look. Maybe it should be 12 hours of vulnerability every day or something, right? And get the feedback from the community, run some polls, get some data for CCP. Like, hey, I pulled all these people, 95% of the players I talked to, and here are the numbers, right? They all agreed that this went too far. They all agreed that this thing might be a better solution, right? And then go to CCP once you have your ducks in a row and say, hey, the whole CSM agrees with me. Here's all their support. The whole player base agrees with me. Here's all these numbers. We really think that this needs to be relooked at, right? And then just keep pressing on that until you see some kind of feedback. And then at the very least, you can go to the community and say, hey, this is what we presented to CCP, and this is what their answer was. And even if that answer is not the answer that I wanted, at the very least, I can provide the community with that kind of like robust two-way communication that allows the community in general to have a way more productive conversation with CCP than they can if there is no justification for these changes.
Okay. And another thing that tends to happen with the CSM is sometimes people who really didn't have a candidate or don't feel that a certain CSM really, is advocating for their play style, they'll go to the one that they feel is the most approachable. how do you think you're going to feel when someone comes that wants to have some sort of change in something that you're not very familiar with?
Well, it sounds like a really exciting opportunity, actually. I mean, I love interacting with the Eve community, right? I love going to FanFest, Eve Vegas, these meetups. I love being involved in the small game community. I like talking to people, right? I like hearing what their opinions are. I think a lot of people agree that Eve is a game that is it's almost more fun to talk about than it is to play sometimes. And so if someone comes to me and they're coming from a play style that I'm not incredibly familiar with, but they feel like, there's no one else on the CSM who really represents them, I think that's a really exciting opportunity actually to go learn about this thing, right? They're like, hey, this niche industry thing doesn't work the way it should, and no one seems to get that. And they're like, wow, I've never heard about that, right? And so maybe I go build the Tech 2 Dreadnought and see that the materials make no sense or something like that, right? I've got plenty of experience in the game, plenty of characters, ISK, anything that I need to go investigate things like that. And so, I mean, honestly, I see it as an opportunity to learn more about the game that I've been playing for a billion years, because as we know, there's always more of Eve to learn.
And the last question in this series is, especially with the last two patches and people demanding that the CSM fix the issue with the skyhooks, if something like this happened on your term, how do you think you're going to balance the wants of the public and them demanding you to, go and fix this thing with your responsibilities as a CSM, which is essentially an advisor, and the NDA? How are you going to make the players feel heard?
Yeah, difficult. I mean, obviously, I will not be breaking the NDA, but I think that, like I've been saying, the CSM is not a game developer position, and I think a lot of candidates and people in the community don't 100% get that, right? You see a lot of platforms that are a list of essentially a wish list of changes, right? And I wish the CSM was a game developer position. I think a lot of the people running for CSM have incredible ideas, right? They understand the game potentially better than many of the developers do. They've been playing for twice as long, right? So I'd love to see the CSM have more power and more influence over the direction of game development, but they don't, right? And that's just the way it is. And so I think you're right. People do often expect CSM members to fix something, and that is not their role, right? They do not get to dictate the direction of development at CCP. But as I've been saying, what we can do is communicate to the community why changes were made. Communicate to the community and say, hey, look, we did bring this up with CCP, right? We talked to them about this. We brought them these things. This is what they said. And if you avoid, data, metrics, upcoming things, you can really talk about a lot of this without even touching on the NDA, right? The fact that you brought up something in CCP and the fact they decided not to change it or whatever is not under NDA, right? There's no problem there. And so I think that the biggest thing in terms of making the players feel heard is showing them that the conversations about the things they needed fixed happened, right? Whether or not the change was implemented, it's neither here nor there. The CSM does not control that, but the CSM can show with monthly diaries about what the meetings have, with responses to DMs and forum posts and things like that, to really show that hey, I made sure that this conversation happened. Sorry, if maybe I can't get the result you want, but I promise you, CCP has heard it, and maybe here is as much as I can tell you about the reason why that change wasn't implemented. And is it a thing that I think we can keep pushing for? Maybe, maybe not, depending on the case of it, right? Maybe Skyhooks, I could say like, hey, we went to them and they said, nope, we're never changing it. We absolutely decided on this. Well, I disagree with that, but I can tell you, right? Hey, it's not really worth pushing on this. They're 100% set in stone. Or I can say, hey, they're actually really open to more feedback here. So I went and talked to them. They want to go back to the community and ping this again. So let's have some polls. Let's get some data, right? Something like that. So I think that, talking to the community, showing that these conversations happened, and divulging as much as you can about the results is the best way I can think of to make sure that individual players feel heard.
Excellent. Now, I have a few questions that came from my community for CSM candidates. One of them is multi-boxing. My community is split right down the middle on multi-boxing bad, multi-boxing good. So, what is your stance on multi-boxing?
It's obviously a complicated question. I think that multi-boxing is an inherent part of Eve, right? Since day one, people have been running multiple accounts, and a lot of the game was, for better or worse, designed around that. I think that in many places it can be an expression of player skill, like in PvP and in small gang, but in other places it can be sort of a metastasized old player advantage, maybe in mining or in industry. I think that balancing it is potentially a sort of impossible Sisyphean task. But I do think that CCP have paid some attention to it over the years. I think the ban of IS Boxer was a good change that really took away the most problematic parts of multi-boxing. And I think that a lot of the times when you have multi-boxing provide a huge advantage, like in mining, it is potentially just a mechanic that is poorly implemented and needs maybe some more hands-on touch. But I don't play in the game spaces that have a huge problem with multi-boxing, right? In small game PvP, the best players I've ever seen can handle maybe 3 accounts, right? At most. And so, most people run 2, but that's about it.
Okay. And then, what do you think is the most pressing issue in all of EVE? Like the number one single issue?
A year ago, I would have said, maybe 2 years ago, I would have said new player retention. And I still think that's a huge issue. I just don't think it's maybe number one anymore. It's definitely up there, but so I think it's dropped from number one to number two. And I think the new number one is probably stagnation, which has been a problem for a long time. But of course, the older the game gets, the worse it's going to get. And this goes back to number three, point number three in my platform, which you can find in great detail. Or sorry, number two, iteration. Number two, which you can find in my forum thread, is change things. Right, the game needs to be changed. We need balance changes. We need things that shake the game up. I really liked the Viridian and Havoc expansions, which totally took another look at LowSec and shook up the LowSec environment tremendously. And I'd like to see more of that. But I also think CCP needs to understand that changes do not need to be in the form of gigantic expansions that rework entire parts of space. Of course, we'd like to see this, right? But I don't want them to be afraid of making minor changes, right? Weekly balance changes, fortnightly changes to the way, storms work or something, right? Whatever it may be. But change is so important in a game this old, right? And if you don't change things, the game starts to stagnate. And once the game starts to stagnate, it starts to die. And so I'm not advocating for a return to chaos era necessarily, where things are changed with no regard for the consequences. But I think that CCP is too timid when it comes to making small, regular changes. These things can be reverted if you double the rate of fire of the Osprey Navy issue or whatever, right? Too strong, put it back, right? And I think that they're afraid to be seen as having made a mistake, and then that sort of handicaps them to make any change. So they clearly take the time to make sure these changes are sort of semi-permanent. Which is upsetting for two reasons. Number one, of course, because it prevents this iteration, because they feel like they can't make a change unless it sticks. But it also seems to prevent them from tuning things back when they do go too far. I mean, how long is it going to be before we see a return to the skyhook balance? Probably a while, right? Because that's the way they operate. But if they had put out these skyhook changes and said, hey, in 1 week, we're going to look at this and we're going to make some change, anything, something, because we have data by then. That would be awesome to hear, right? But instead, we're just sitting here like, well, maybe they don't touch this for 6 months or a year. We have no idea, right? Because they don't make these little changes and they're afraid to tweak things.
Okay, very cool. Now, you had mentioned before that you're in small gang PvP. Oh, yeah. What do you think is the best advice for brand new players coming into the game to get into PvP?
Well, I think the best thing that new players can do to get into PvP. I mean, obviously, the first thing you have to do is get out there, right? You can't have PvP unless you're out there in space, in LowSec or in wormhole space or something, trying the game. But it's a complicated game, right? And so the best thing is to find a community that can teach you, like EVE Rookies, like EVE Uni, like these other small groups, MPSI groups that can take you along, right? And you can't necessarily learn the things you need to learn about PvP, not to be good necessarily, just to get out there from YouTube. You got to go play the game, right? And so find a community. There are so many great communities out there. Find a community who will teach you the very basics. Get out there and play. You will learn, I promise. Fundamentally, it's not that bad. Not that complicated.
What do you think one of the biggest challenges for new players getting into PvP is? Besides the skill issue.
Finding these groups. Oh yeah, we've talked about the skills, yeah. But I think when you talk to people who are active in PvP and you go back on their story, I think you hear the same story over and over again, which is they played in high sec, they did missions, they went and ratted in null sec, but then one day, however it may be, they got their first taste of PvP, right? And from then on, they were hooked. And so I think that the most challenging thing is getting people out there and getting them to get that first taste. And once they have that, I think everything else will follow.
What do you think is easier, solo PvP or fleet PvP?
Well, I think that fleet PvP, of course, is easier. You don't necessarily have to think for yourself. I think solo PvP can be extremely challenging, but I think small gang is the learning sweet spot because you don't have the incredible pressure of solo PvP, and that's pressure of skill, but also of skills in the game. Where like I said, if you don't have certain skills, if you have a Merlin with Tech 1 guns and you slide into low sec space, you are not going to you're not going to be successful as a solo player. It's going to be very, very challenging. But also in fleet combat, whether or not you're successful is completely not up to you, right? It's irrelevant. And so I think in small gang PvP, it's a great sweet spot because you matter, your choices matter, you can make a difference, but it's not all on you, right? There is someone who can sort of guide you through things that can delegate a little bit of responsibility to you, and you can find that sweet spot. Like, oh, I want to be more of a DPS person because I need to learn how to pilot my ship, or I'm getting a little more comfortable. I'd love to play some tackle role, right? Something like that gives you the opportunity to learn and grow into roles and able to see the results, right, of your which you don't see in larger fleets.
So then, what type of ship should a new bro use for their very first PvP ship?
I think the classic Condor is a great place to start. I think tackle is a good role. There's a lot of learning to be done to be a good tackle pilot, but there's not a lot of learning to be done to be an effective tackle pilot. If you lose a Condor, it's not the end of the world. If the Condor hits approach on some guy's 5 bill Vedmak and gets a scram, that could make a huge difference. You're going to lose your Condor, sure, but you're going to secure that kill for your gang, and you're going to feel like you've made a difference.
Cool. All right, so then I have one more question before we turn it over to the Twitch audience. Out of the, I think we're down to 48 candidates now. Out of the 48 candidates, besides yourself, who else would you like to see elected alongside you?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of great candidates, and I think that we're kind of spoiled for choice here. There's definitely more than 10 good candidates. So some people that I think are good are not going to make it in, unfortunately. But if I could pick just a couple people that I would love to get in with me, I think my top 2 choices would be Phantomite and the Oz. I think that they both represent very, very different parts of the game. So it'd be great to have that diversity. And I think that in the sort of parts of the game and the changes that they propose, they're both probably the most educated and the most well thought out people in those spaces in the entire game. So I think CCP and the CSM could really, really, really benefit from both of their experience on the CSM.
Okay, so does anyone out in Twitchland have any questions? We'll go ahead and give them a few minutes to type.
Sure, no problem.
Is there anything else that we didn't cover that you would like to mention?
I think we pretty much hit all the major points. My platform is not a complicated one. I want more communication, I want iteration, and I want to make sure we keep focusing on those little things. That's pretty much it.
So Mr. Savage said you already help the community tons, even by not being CSM, so that's a huge compliment.
I believe he's referring to Oz, and I completely agree with his assessment there. Oz is a great guy and has done a lot with his weekly economic reports. And he's always a great content creator to watch.
Here's an interesting question. Describe yourself with 3 ships and why from EVE Online.
That's a very interesting question. Well, my favorite ship in the game, my number 1 ship, if you look me up on Zkill, is the Humble Stabber, which I think is represents me, and it's my favorite ship because it's cheap, but it's really effective, and it really emphasizes player skill. Right, you can do almost nothing with the stabber if you don't know what you're doing, but in the right hands, it can be really, really, really effective, and that's something that's very enjoyable to me about Eve. I don't know about 3 ships, but perhaps my second place would be some sort of unique ship, maybe in Maracha, because I just really enjoy flying them.
Anybody else have any questions? You've done a great job in LoSec. How do you plan on changing the game? And how much do you miss Tama?
Sometimes I do miss Tama, and sometimes I don't. It was a very interesting place, and I lived there for a very long time. Um, in terms of changing the game, I would really like to see, uh, and this is just a personal wish list, right? This is not something that necessarily I can accomplish as CSM, but I would really like to see some iteration on wormhole space. I think that there's been so many expansions now that have had the opportunity to touch on wormhole space, and they just haven't taken it. And I think it's a real shame. The biggest expansion that wormholes ever saw was Citadel in 2016, which of course was not an expansion for wormhole space. It was just happened to touch on it because we gave us Citadels. But there could be, just in terms of the structures that were introduced in Citadel, there's so much opportunity for structures that work in wormhole space, scanning structures, maybe something that can roll wormholes for you with a huge amount of risk, whatever, right? I mean, I'm not a game developer, but I would love to see CCP understand that when they introduce new systems into the game, as I said before, once you build something, you build the faction warfare frontline system, you build citadels, right? You've done 90% of the work to make these huge impactful changes. And so to not iterate on these things, to not continue pushing them into as much of the game as you can, it's a waste of that dev time, right? And so I'd love to see some love for wormholes.
Okay, so next question is, what specifically do you do in Eve, and what is your stance on how the recent changes have affected how you play?
Good question. So, as I said before, I'm a small gang PvPer, so I fly in groups of 10 or very often much less. And we try to take outnumbered fights, and we try to fight larger groups. And recent changes, of course, well, there was the Skyhook change, which essentially just took a lot of our gameplay out back and shot it in the head. So I would love to see that change we looked at again. This is far from a controversial or unique opinion. I think a lot of people are unhappy with that Skyhook change. But as it relates to my platform, at the very least, I would love to have seen a more coherent explanation about why that change was made, right? If you look in that dev blog, all we really get are these sort of vague platitudes, right? I think one of them says, to improve the attractiveness of these structures. Well, that doesn't tell us anything, right? Like, why do we need to improve the attractiveness of these structures? Is the adoption low, right? Are there a lot of skyhook capable planets that don't have skyhooks? I don't know. Are there not enough reagents in the economy, for example? No idea, right? So what we get from this dev blog is nothing that we can sink our teeth into and have an actual discussion about, right? And so I don't agree with the change, but it would make a lot easier to actually engage with the change if I understood why it was made in the first place.
Totally agree with that one. Okay, so we'll let some more questions come in, and I have one for you.
Yeah, what's up?
What do you think about ansiblexes and projection?
Yeah, I've never been in a large null alliance, so I've never experienced antiplexes at their full power. But certainly, as a small ganger, we know to watch out for them because we know that these groups can project huge fleets to us with very little effort if we stir the beehive a little too much. I defer in this matter to more experienced CSM members like Phantomite, who I know wants Antiplexes to be toned down, who wants Antiplexes to have more subtle nerfs, for example, removing the ability to use ACLs or something like that on Antiplexes to make them more of a soft thing, to either open them to everyone or to restrict them to perhaps just the alliance anchored them. And so I think that the best thing, if this were to come up in a CSM discussion, is for me to listen to the CSM members that have more experiences with antiplexes and try to come up with, my own opinion based on the knowledge that they have. Because like I was saying before, we can always learn more about Eve, and there's always someone who has the experience in some area that you don't.
So we had Dark Dwayne ask, is the NDA actually clear enough to make sure you know what you can and cannot share? One of the things that you get when you become CSM, of course, you get the NDA, so you actually see what's in it. But also, you kind of get a crash course on what you can and can't say. And you also have, past CSM, we had the changeover team. So, like, the CSM19 talked to 18 and, kind of gave us advice on what we can say and can't say. And we had a couple people sitting on CSM as well that, kind of guided us. So I think every CSM that comes on kind of starts learning what they can and can't say, and goes from there.
Yeah, that makes sense. And also, like I said, a lot of the communication that I want to have is in the form of forum posts or Reddit posts to answer specific questions. And so I can't imagine that it'd be a problem to run those by. Maybe DM CCP Swift and say, hey, I want to answer this question. I want to explain some of the thought process that went on. Could you just take a look at this post real fast and make sure it doesn't fall afoul of any NDA related problems? Yeah. So I don't anticipate that being a huge problem.
And the last question that I have for you is, what is your stance on filaments?
I think filaments are a really good addition to the game. I understand completely the nullsec frustration with them. If someone comes into your space, you force them out, and then they just disappear, and you have no chance for counterplay. I think that there is space for counterplay to be added in some sense. Maybe the filament stays open for a couple minutes. Maybe it has a spool up timer or something like that. But it would need pretty extensive testing, because I don't think that right now it's game breaking. I understand the frustration, but I don't think it's game breaking.
So from talking to nullsec residents and the nullsec CSM, it seems to me that their bigger problem is not the Needlejack. It's more the Pochvan Express, being able to get out of jail free and leave null completely. So they can't really chase you.
Well, Needlejacks get you out of jail as well, right? Like fundamentally, if you were a nullsec inhabitant, you have some small game peers come into your space, they poke your skyhooks, they poke your ESS, whatever, you form up big for them, and then they warp to a safe spot and filament. I don't think it's really relevant to you whether that was a Pochvan filament or a Needlejack filament, right? They're gone either way, and you're now able to camp them in, you're not able to punish them for invading. So I think that the fundamental problem with filaments is that it is a get out of jail free card, but I don't think that's a real distinction between Needlejack and Pochvan. It's nicer for the small ganger to be able to go to Pochvan and dock up, but I don't think that impacts the nullsec resident, whether it was a Pochvan or they just went to some other space in nullsec.
Okay, great. Looks like the questions stopped coming in, so I'll go ahead and let you tell everybody where they can find you, Discords or...
Yeah, best place if you have questions for me is just DM me on Discord. My name is just Itaer, like it is there. And if you want to see my platform laid out in any more depth and perhaps some more eloquence, definitely head over to the CSM section of the forums and find the section for Itaer, and perhaps leave a comment or a like if you have any questions or support you want to leave me.
Perfect. I will be putting your thread in the description of the video once it goes up on YouTube, so they'll be able to go and engage with you there. Also be aware that people may leave comments on the video, so once I put that in your thread, make sure to keep an eye on it.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate you taking the time to talk to me. I know you stayed up a little late for this, so appreciate it.
I appreciate you coming, and I hope that you have a really great campaign, and best of luck.
Thank you very much. I appreciate that. Same to you. All right. Thanks, everyone. Thanks for listening. Thanks for the questions from the audience. And I hope everyone has a great day.
Okay.
See you later.
Bye-bye.